Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Tom Stoppard's play, The Invention of Love. So the Saturday before I recorded this, unfortunately, Tom Stoppard died. He was one of the greatest playwrights of the latter portion of the 20th century and the first portion of the 21st. He was a pioneer of postmodern theater, an absolute theatrical genius. He wrote tons and tons and tons of amazing plays. And so in honor of him, I wanted to read and make a video about one that I've not read before by him. So The Invention of Love. This is a play about A.E. Housman, who of course was a British poet and classicist. He had a very interesting life in a number of different ways. He went to Oxford. He did not actually graduate from Oxford, even though he was widely expected to be one of the most successful students in his class. He was basically regarded by everybody as brilliant. His poems are fascinating. I haven't actually read a lot of Housman's poetry. I've read a couple of things. I don't know. For some reason, it's weird, right? It's one of those things where, like, for some reason, I just at some point settled on the idea that I just didn't really want to read A.E. Housman for no good reason. And that prejudice has kind of stuck with me, although I have now read some of his stuff, and it actually is quite good. But he went on to get a job in the British Patent Office, and he just kept doing scholarship about mostly Latin literature, Latin poetry primarily, I think. And like he did this amazing scholarship while working in the Patent Office, and he was so good at it that when he applied for a chair of Latin position, I forget where it was, even though I just read the play recently, but he applied for this chair of Latin position at one of the universities, and they were like, yeah, okay. I mean, you didn't actually graduate from Oxford, but we don't care. Your accomplishments in this field have been so impressive. And one of the things that's really sort of interesting about him as a scholar is he was incredibly curmudgeonly. And that's not always a good thing. I mean, in some ways is a very bad thing because, for instance, he had a somewhat misogynist approach once universities started allowing women in, where like he would not learn female students' names because supposedly he said that it just wasn't an important thing to take up space in his brain with. So he was not an all-around great guy. But he had, the sort of cool, almost like Diogenes the Cynic type thing about A.E. Housman is he had this very sort of strict set of academic standards, and anybody who did not meet them, including his colleagues, including other sort of top-tier classicists, what we would now call classicists, people who studied Greek and Latin, literature, philosophy, whatever it is. Like anybody who did not meet it, his criticism was just vicious. So that's kind of awesome. But one of the things, so also Housman had very few, it seems, real personal relationships. And one of the things about him is that it seems that at Oxford, he had fallen in love with a guy named Moses Jackson. Moses John Jackson. I knew he had a middle name, and I couldn't remember what it was. Yeah, so he fell in love with this guy named Moses John Jackson, who did not return his feelings. And that there is speculation that something was going on with Jackson at the time, and that is why Housman did not graduate. but I think that's speculation. They did go on to sort of live together, work together, and then at some point, Houseman apparently told Jackson how he felt. Jackson was like, listen, sorry, I don't feel that way about you. And that seems to have really sort of scuppered the friendship, as it very well might. So that's A.E. Houseman, and the reason that I give you all of that sort of basic biographical detail is that that's all really important to the play itself. The play starts with a character named A.E.H., who is an elderly version of Houseman just after his death. And it actually opens, it says, A.E.H., aged 77 and getting no older, wearing a buttoned-up dark suit and neat black boots, stands on the banks of the Styx, watching the approach of the ferryman Charon. Charon is the ferryman from Greek and Roman mythology, right? The person, the entity, not really person, I suppose, who would ferry you across the river Styx from the land of the living to the underworld. And so we open with A.E.H., this older version of A.E. Houseman, basically entering the Greco-Roman underworld. And he has conversations with Charon about the various people in the underworld, about Greek and Latin poetry and literature and drama, etc., etc. But then we have the entrance of the three Oxford companions. Houseman, who's just called Houseman, that's the younger Oxford and slightly older, slightly post-Oxford age iteration of A.E. Houseman. Alfred William Pollard and Moses John Jackson. They enter on a boat with a dog, and they're having a debate about stuff, right? And so you have A.E.H. sort of observing these various incidents from his life and incidents from the university at Oxford around the time that he had attended, etc., etc. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about the play, so there is certainly an LGBT component to this play, a queer component to this play, because Houseman is in love with Jackson, and that love is not reciprocated. But I actually don't think it's very central to the play. Even though there's a lot of discussion about the Greco-Roman attitudes toward homosexuality or pederasty, we have Oscar Wilde, who makes an appearance. Oscar Wilde, of course, being one of the most famous gay men of the 19th century, in large part because of his trial for homosexuality. And there's all these sort of discussions of like rumors about people like Walter Pater and John Ruskin and their relationships with the undergrads at Oxford, and all this stuff, right? There's these bits and pieces of like intrigue and debate, all circling underneath the sort of ostensible blanket of Victorian morality. So all of that stuff is in there, and it's definitely worth talking about. But what I personally find most interesting about the play is these elements of classical reception, because Houseman was, again, what we would now call a classicist, but it might be more accurate to describe what he does, at least in this play, as closer to philology. So philology is sort of the study of ancient languages and manuscripts and texts as such, as opposed to like what we in literary studies do, where we're attempting to figure out the meaning of text within social contexts and how they comment on what's going on, how texts create meaning by engaging with the world around them, etc., etc. That's not necessarily what he's interested in. What he is interested in is like, we have a bunch of different manuscript versions of this Ovid poem or whatever it is, and they're all slightly different, right? Because they've been copied by different people, they've been carried over, maybe there was multiple copies made. None of these were written by Ovid, they're all much later, and we've got different versions, right? They say slightly different things. It's sort of like with Shakespeare plays, there were quarto versions that were published unofficially, often during Shakespeare's lifetime. And the folio version comes out in 1623, the first folio. And there are differences between, say, the first, second, and third quartos of a play like Hamlet versus the folio edition, right? And sometimes there's big differences, and sometimes there's very small differences. And so a lot of what Houseman and the other classicists are dealing with in this play is these very small differences. Like, is it this letter or this other letter? And there are very different words in Latin. And so you have the goal is to sort of reconstruct what Ovid or Horace or Seneca or Catullus or whoever it was said, right? What they originally wrote. And there's a number of different strategies people take to this. But the play becomes very interested in that. And in what it means that these ancient texts are received in certain ways, that they are translated or edited in certain ways, and what are the forces that contribute to that. So, we have, for instance, this character, let me find his first name, Benjamin Jowett. He was a master of Balliol College, and he was a classicist. He translated a number of things. And we get this bit where Jowett is confronting Walter Pater about a relationship with an undergrad at Balliol. And it's not clear that it's a sexual relationship, but certainly is flirty, we'll say. And Jowett says this. So Pater says, No, I am astonished that you should take exception to an obviously platonic enthusiasm. And Jowett says, a platonic enthusiasm, as far as Plato was concerned, meant an enthusiasm of the kind that would empty the public schools and fill the prisons were it not nipped in the bud. Same-sex sexuality, or pederasty, perhaps more accurately. Then he goes on to say this. In my translation of the Phaedrus, it required all my ingenuity to rephrase his depiction of pederastia into the affectionate regard as exists between an Englishman and his wife. Plato would have made the transposition himself if he had had the good fortune to be a Balliol man. By the affectionate regard as exists between an Englishman and his wife presumably means not having sex, which is not necessarily an endorsement of the English Victorian way of life. But this is a really interesting one, right? Because much of Houseman's work throughout his career focuses on sort of this idea of we need to figure out what the ancients actually said. need a direct translation or version of it. And what Jowett is here saying is the complete opposite of that. It is, we need to make all of the ancients what they would say today if they were English Victorians, rather than what they say, right? In my translation of the Phaedrus, it required all my ingenuity to rephrase his depiction of pederastia. I know what Plato was saying. I am aware of what Plato said and of what Plato meant. And I have chosen in my translation to specifically change what Plato meant because I do not feel that it is appropriate. And so this is sort of the interesting thing, right? Is that it raises these sort of interesting questions. When you have these, interesting at least for me as someone who does adaptation studies and is very sort of interested in the classics, it raises these interesting questions because if you have the objective of, I want to translate Plato, let's say, then generally most of us would think, I want to put into the English language what Plato had said in Greek. And that is decidedly not Jowett's objective here. So again, this interesting debate in translation studies and classics to a lesser extent. I think classicists who can actually read Greek and Latin are somewhat less concerned with this, but they are still concerned with these sort of questions of which is the right version of these manuscripts, which is the right word, the right term, and how does that change what these texts mean. So we've got all these interesting things about how we engage with the materials of the ancient world and why we engage with it in those ways. And again, for me, I think that's really, really fascinating.